Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our study of Asian reactions to European imperialism by diving into the Meiji era of expansion. As you hopefully remember last time, the Japanese reacted to the arrival of Matthew Perry and the Black Fleet with with a campaign of industrialization, modernization, and adopting of European customs and practices, grafting them onto traditional Japanese power structures. So today we're going to look at the effects of this, the rise of Japanese nationalism, and how the Japanese really attempted to take their place as one of the great world powers by building their own territorial empire based in East Asia. So, with the beginning of this, we see Japanese nationalism. The Meiji Restoration was both a power struggle between various clans and a sort of return to some traditional Japanese models, venerating the emperor and things like that. We got some adaptation and adaptation of European customs and a real movement away from at least some elements of samurai culture, trying to focus on veneration of the emperor, sort of a very top down, sort of hierarchical structure to some extent, and really the marginalization of samurai groups. We saw the modernization of education movements, and here we see a merging of new educational movements, emperor veneration, and traditional Confucian values. So take a moment, pause, and read. And we saw a massive military reorganization and the expectation that, a path to glory, riches, and honor was through military duty. We see the creation of a modern European style navy and a modern European style army for the Japanese, organized on very European models in an attempt to emulate and, to some degree better what Europeans were doing. The British were sort of the model for the Japanese Imperial Navy, being one of the most powerful naval countries on earth. And the Germans were really the model for the Japanese army. We can see here, to some extent, the ability of the Japanese to adapt and to modernize. So take a moment, pause, and take this in, and then we'll move forward. First example, and we already talked about this from the Chinese perspective, of course, but the first example of the Japanese being able to put these into use was the first Sino-Japanese War. We talked about previously how China had been being carved up into spheres of influence through the unequal treaties, the Treaty of Nanjing, and then, of course, the treaties after the Second Opium War. The Japanese, of course, wanted the ability to, again, also take spheres of influence in China. And so, as we talked about, the Beiyang fleet was utterly destroyed by this modern Japanese battleship fleet, partially because of, better Japanese design, partially because of better Japanese strategy, and partially because, it turns out filling your explosive shells with sand in order to build large marble boats is not a really good military strategy. We had also talked about how the ever victorious army was not ever victorious, was utterly destroyed, and how the Japanese were trying to expand their control over both the Korean peninsula, the island of Taiwan, and also the Liaodong Peninsula here. The Japanese, as we mentioned, this is also the first example of the Japanese really using pretty brutal, really being pretty brutal to Chinese prisoners with sort of summary executions and really inhumane treatment. And so the Japanese were able to defeat the Chinese and did start to get some territory. But in the end, the Triple Intervention and the Treaty of Shimonoseki really scaled back the places where the Japanese would really actually be able to occupy. In the original treaty, they would only get part of Korea and then the island of Taiwan. And this really upset the Japanese because they felt like, although they had acted as a European equal, they were really not being treated as an equal by Europeans at the bargaining table. And so the very territory that they won on the battlefield was then taken away from them by other European powers, which led the Japanese to ally with the British, as we talked about last time, in order to get a European power on their side in case it came to war with the British or the French or the Russians or these other groups. We also talked about how the Boxer Rebellion, the anti-Western rebellion in northern China, was embraced by the Chinese government to try to drive out foreigners, but also how the Japanese played a central role in putting down this rebellion. Although it was a multinational coalition that took down the Boxers, more than half the troops involved were Japanese, because of course the Japanese had the largest forces in the area. And the Japanese played an incredibly central role in driving these Boxers out of Beijing, establishing the safety of foreign enclaves and things like that in these areas. But in the aftermath, yet again, the Japanese were cheated out of what they thought should have been their territorial areas of control. The Japanese especially wanted control over Manchuria, which is an area that is rich in coal and other natural resources, and who the Japanese saw as their what should be their right sphere of influence. But in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, instead the Russians got control over this area and the Liaodong Peninsula in order to help build their railway, connect in the western port of Vladivostok, and further their own eastern ambitions, creating significant tension between the Japanese and the Russians going forward, and really setting the stage for the eventual Russo-Japanese War, which would determine who would have primacy over sort of the northern parts of China. So as we talked about, so hopefully it makes sense and we set the stage for why Russia and Japan were on a collision course. There's, of course, a whole bunch of other things going on here. Both the Russians and the Japanese were sort of latecomers to the industrialization and imperialization game. The Japanese embracing it with gusto, whereas the Russians were very sort of lukewarm about their imperial ambitions. The Russians were also seen by a lot of the really racist powers of Europe, namely Germany, as really a check against what they had started to call the Yellow Menace. This idea that Asian powers were rising up, and if there wasn't a European power to check the rising power of these Asian societies, that eventually these Asian powers would sort of overwhelm Europe and destroy them in some sort of neo-Mongolian horde thing. All of this is, of course, based on a combination of spectacular racism and a real misunderstanding of what was going on in Asia. But that, of course, didn't stop the Kaiser Willy from writing letters to his cousin Nikki the Tsar, encouraging him to take on Japan and put the Japanese in their place, and establish Russian domination over Asia. Admittedly, probably even if this had happened, the British and the French probably would not have fully allowed it. But in the end, most Europeans saw a Russo-Japanese War as something that might be necessary. And for the Russians, it was assumed that they would be able to crush the Japanese. I mean, on paper, Russia is a significantly larger and more powerful country than Japan. There was also a lot of racism going on here, with the Russians assuming that because they were European, they were superior. This is the era, of course, of social Darwinism. We see some Japanese propaganda, pointing to the threat of Russia as this sort of expanding power. And so both sides are, putting out propaganda against the others. And in the end, the fight was going to be over the Liaodong Peninsula here, and of course, primacy over Korea and Manchuria. So both sides, in the end, were very antagonistic towards each other. There was some attempts by the Japanese to negotiate, and the Russians basically made their negotiating team just sit around and do nothing and refused to even meet with them. The Russians were very provocative in this whole process. And in the end, the battle between these two sides was spectacularly fierce. And this is going to be one of the wars that really demonstrates that traditional military strategy is just going to be super unequal to modern weapons. So take a moment, read about the Japanese assault on Port Arthur or Dalian, and take away what we have to take, and take away the effect of trying to use traditional tactics against modern weapons. So pause, read, and then we'll move on. The siege of Dalian, or Port Arthur, was an incredibly brutal siege. The Russians learned a very tough lesson here, which was that they thought their fleet, which was enough to beat the Ottoman Empire, would be enough to drive off the Japanese. But instead, their Pacific fleet got trapped in the harbor of Dalian and was more or less just bombarded to pieces by the Japanese. The Japanese were then able to land troops and surround the fortress city of Port Arthur, or Dalian, and launched repeated assaults against the city, which the Russians were able to fight off because of a combination of artillery and machine guns. But the Japanese had the logistics. They were able to establish cannons that could bombard the city, and they were eventually able to starve the city of Dalian into submission. The destruction of the Russian fleet was also a spectacular humiliation for the Russians. And Once the Japanese took the city, they were absolutely brutal to the prisoners there. So pause and read the Creelman accounts of the Japanese taking of Port Arthur. From there, the Japanese then moved in and started building railways and moved towards the Russian city of Harbin. This slog, this overland fight became an incredibly bloody, incredibly difficult fight. Both sides began to utilize trench warfare, and both sides quickly realized that defense was much stronger than attack in this situation. Both sides also began to greatly stretch their resources beyond their capacity. The Japanese started to realize that they didn't have the supply lines, the troops, or the money to fight a protracted land war in Manchuria. And the Russians began to realize that the Trans-Siberian Railway, as fantastic as it was, really wasn't enough to be able to move all the troops and supplies they needed way out to the far side of the Russian Empire. And so both sides lost huge amounts of troops, spent spectacular amounts of money, and both of their peoples started to get really worn out with the protracted trench warfare in Manchuria. This was really, for anyone who was interested in watching it, was really a preview of what we'd start to see in World War I, where huge amounts of troops and lives are lost in order to gain very little territory. And, where significant cost of life doesn't really get you really anywhere. So the Russians decided to send their Baltic fleet, the fleet that was based out of St. Petersburg here, to go and defeat the Japanese, with the understanding, or at least the belief, that yes, okay, the Japanese beat our Pacific fleet, but that was not a particularly advanced fleet. All of our best ships are over in the European theater, and so once we send them over here, we'll be able to teach the Japanese a thing or two, force them to surrender, and establish really our primacy over Asia. And so the Russians decided to send their fleet on an 18,000-mile voyage all the way around Africa. The British would not let them use the Suez Canal because of their alliance with the Japanese. And so this quote-unquote voyage of the damned took a huge toll on the Russian fleet and really established that the Russian Navy was not as great as they could have been. And so they go through all of these horrific embarrassments as the Russians are trying to go around the coast of Africa. There's navigational problems. They accidentally attack a series of Spanish fishing boats, thinking that they're Japanese ships. They get infested with a combination of monkeys and iguanas going around Africa, and then who eat up a significant portion of their supplies. And by the time the Russian fleet gets to Japan, they're honestly not in particularly good shape. The hulls are pretty damaged. The crews are demoralized. They're running out of supplies. And so they try to make a dash for Vladivostok, but the Japanese fleet meets them at the Battle of Tsushima, and they pretty much devastate the Russian fleet. The Russians are not in an effective battle formation. Each Russian ship comes in range of all the Japanese ships at the same time, the whole crossing the T thing. And the Japanese are able to devastate one by one the entire Russian Baltic fleet and sink it to the bottom of the Straits of Tsushima. And so the Japanese win the Battle of Tsushima, and then the war kind of grinds to a halt because neither side is able to bring the force to bear to win in Manchuria. American President Theodore Roosevelt negotiates the Treaty of Portsmouth, which is negotiated in Portsmouth, Maine, in the United States. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for this, which, if you know anything about Theodore Roosevelt, is spectacularly ironic. And the Japanese are forced to sign a treaty in which they get Korea, but they don't get Port Arthur, and they don't really get control over Manchuria. And so this leads to massive riots in Japan once the treaty is announced, and significant social unrest. The Japanese yet again feel that they've been wrong-footed by the Europeans, and they've been treated as an unequal power. And so they don't have any choice except to sign because, again, they don't have the ability to keep fighting. But at the same time, clearly the Japanese public are unhappy with their government and are going to call for much more aggressive tactics going forward in order to make sure that they can take their place as a great world power. In Japan, the Meiji emperor also dies right about this time period, and we enter into the Taisho Era, where his son, the son of Muchihito, becomes Emperor Taisho, and he is not a particularly vigorous leader. He suffered from both physical and mental disabilities, and so Japan is going to enter into this interesting period of modernization, where the economy and the civilian government are going to advance, and the military is also going to advance, but very disconnected from each other. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Taisho era going forward, but just keep in mind the Taisho era happens at this time. Japan officially annexes Korea and then starts to annex the Dalian Peninsula just against the Treaty of Portsmouth, and basically no one does anything about it at this point. Here we can see the Emperor of Korea signing the Treaty of Alliance with Japan in the aftermath of the war. And what we start to see is Japan building a much larger empire and mostly ignoring European treaties and European public opinion. In Russia, things go much, much worse. The war in Manchuria was incredibly unpopular in Russia, and it really cut down on the Tsar's credibility. He had been facing domestic pressures to push reforms, and he had hoped that a quick victory over Japan would really solidify his power, and instead it led and unleashed the forces of social revolution. Workers in St. Petersburg staged a general strike, which led to Bloody Sunday, the Russian troops firing on these unarmed workers who were marching as to try to get changes. We saw mutinies within the Russian army. Russian forces mutinied in a number of Russian cities. The modern Russian battleship Potemkin was seized by mutineers and basically stolen. And we started to see forces that might actually topple the Tsar. And so there was a real question in 1905, would the loss in the Russo-Japanese War lead to the Tsar's abdication and destruction? The Tsar instead decided to push reforms. He decided to embrace this idea of at least some democracy, creating a legislative body called the Duma. He also agreed to open up censorship laws and bring in some new Enlightenment principles that Russian reformers had been calling for a long time. But then, a few months after these reforms, he went back on this. Pro-monarchist, pro-czarist groups called the Black Hundreds went to attack reformers, re-solidify the Tsar's control over everything. There was a new age of repression, and the days of freedom in Russia would end. So the revolution of 1905 did create some constitutional changes, but in practice, the Tsar's power was totally unquestioned. He reestablished control over society and really refused to embrace any of the reforms that he felt like had been forced upon him in the revolution of 1905. So this is the age of Meiji expansion and the effect of this on both Japan and Russia. For next time, we're going to head over to Africa and look at the responses of the reactions of Africans to European imperialism. So for now, we're going to leave Asia behind and talk about other regions before we eventually set up the whole beginning of World War I. Thank you for listening.